Okay, if I appear a bit flustered for the first couple minutes of this conversation, it's because I am. I never would have expected to be on the same screen as the iconic Bob Costas. Bob, thank you for doing this, by the way.
Brody, I'm doing it because I'm a fan of yours, although we've never met in person. And there's so much information and content coming at all of us from so many different directions. But I've come across your stuff. And after I did, I began to seek it out. And I like the way you approach what you do. I also accept that I am now iconic or venerable or whatever. But I remember when I broke in at NBC in the 80s, I was the irreverent newcomer. And now I've gone from fresh-faced, irreverent newcomer to iconic, sage, and the horizon is within sight as I walk off into the distance. They'll begin shooting me from behind as the sunset looms in front of me.
You know, we both broke in the 80s. You broke into broadcasting. I broke into the world. Not to date you.
I get it. You know, people come up to me all the time, and I've been watching you or listening to you my entire life. Okay, and they're 40 or even 50. But when some guy says, I grew up listening to you, I look at the guy, he's 75 years old. What the hell am I, Methuselah? What's going on here?
That math just doesn't add up.
Right.
Well, since we're talking about the landscape of sports media and how things have gone here in 2025, I feel like, and it's crazy, right? Like, this is how you found me, via my YouTube channel, crazy as that sounds. But the sports media landscape, it's really changing. There's kind of like a hard line in the sand, I feel. Old media and new media. You're either one or the other. There are some crossovers, like I think Pat McAfee might be an example of that. It's a good time, I think, to be a sports fan and consumer of all this. You've got plenty of choices. You've got plenty of options.
Yeah.
How about for those of us who work in this business? Is it a good time with old media and new sports media?
I think it's a mixed bag. The old media platforms are trying to figure it out. There are a few things that still hold. The NFL still holds in classic fashion on CBS, NBC, ABC/ESPN, Fox. That still works. But with cord cutting and whatnot, the platforms that we used to think were going to be there forever, they're still there, but their influence is less.
Yeah.
I think the same thing is true of a sports consumer as a news consumer. What's critical here is media literacy. When I speak to classes at my alma mater at Syracuse, which has always had a tremendous communications and journalism department, and others around the country, the point I make is, or among the points I make is, the technology doesn't matter. It's only generational that I prefer to hold a newspaper in my hand when I can get a newspaper, as opposed to scrolling, which I do because you can't always get a newspaper. That's generational. But what should be timeless is that credibility and quality should count. And I think that in much of the new media, if you're not discerning about how you consume it, whether it's something as relatively unimportant as most of what happens in sports, or whether it's news, if you can't differentiate the credible from the not credible, then you're less well off. And I think that what's also happened, and I'm certainly not alone in this observation, this thing, which we hold in our hands, no matter, you could be 90 years old, it's still, to a certain extent, rewired your brain.
Yes.
And your attention span. I don't think that everything needs to be geared towards someone with the attention span of a gnat. And what you do flies in the face of what is, I think, a troubling trend, which is, hey, that's good, but can you cut it down? You know, a lot of stuff that now happens even in what used to be called mainstream media, that they almost give you a merit badge. If you take something that's 3 minutes long and make it 1:47, even if a lot of the context went out, even if a lot of the antecedent on which the laugh is predicated upon went away, you know, I don't think that it's the equivalent of reading War and Peace aloud to say, I need 3 minutes for this instead of 48 seconds to make a point, or to speak in paragraphs rather than in sound bites. And I don't think necessarily that personality is measured in decibel levels.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can talk to each other as adults and still have a sense of humor and a sense of irony. I think there's a difference between irreverence and snark. And the coin of the realm in a lot of places on the internet is snark. And it's obvious that Twitter and now X and whatever else, and the comment sections after perfectly credible articles can sometimes resemble a hellscape. It's disproportionately populated. There's a lot of valid stuff that goes on there, but disproportionately populated by people who have there's no bar of entry in terms of credibility, knowledge of the subject, honesty, and there's no accountability. Even the person at a newspaper, magazine, or at a television station who has the least allegiance to quality and credibility is held accountable by somebody. But on the internet, you're not. It's the Wild West, and it is what it is. But someone, no matter what age they are, no matter what stage of life, ought to be able to discern what's credible and worthwhile from what's not. Something that bothers me is when a newspaper publishes an opinion column by someone that may have won a Pulitzer Prize. Letters to the editor, the key word is editor. You could disagree with the person, agree with them, and maybe they'll even print a crackpot letter or two just for the humor of it. But once they open the gates and there's 500 comments, a lot of those comments are fact-averse and they're ad hominem nonsense. And you would think that newspaper would take its standards, the standard that it had for many years, just take it to the new technology. I know I've gone on a while here, but that's what podcasts or YouTube allows you to do. It doesn't make any difference whether someone carved it on the wall of a cave with a jagged rock, or it came off Gutenberg's printing press, or it came off something they'll invent tomorrow and they'll put a chip in the palm of your hand so you don't even have to carry the phone. What matters is credibility and quality. And as long as there's an enduring standard for that, I'm okay with it.
You mentioned the comment section. Wait until you see these comments on this video that I'm about to publish of this interview on YouTube. They're going to be great, though. These ones will be great.
I'm sure. One or more certain to be like this. Used to love Costas, but now he doesn't like Trump. He hates America. That's right, because that's a good notion. The litmus test for how much you love America is how much you approve of Trump. I was unaware of that, but that's the new rule.
Welcome to 2025.
Yeah.
It kind of brings me to where you were going with this, and I think half of it is the interpretation of what you're watching. The other half is the presentation, and I think in our business, there's two ways you can go about things, and I think this is where you and I are most common. If I could include myself in your conversation, in your same sentence as you, it's that we try and offer sensible presentation, sensible thoughts, versus the easy thing and the tempting thing to do is to go out there and talk about sports with hot takes, right? Because those make the most waves. To your point earlier, those are the loudest voices. How do you see the difference in sports media presentation? Because obviously those two things, they don't even really compete against each other, but they both exist.
Yeah, I'm not a hot take guy. That doesn't mean that I think everything has to be deadly serious, and that there isn't a place for irreverence. In fact, the word irreverent was practically attached to my name for much of my career. But the nicest thing that anyone ever wrote about me, at least my favorite, was someone who said he's reverent and irreverent at the same time.
It's better than irrelevant, right?
Right. Well, that's what's coming next. You're in just under the wire. But I admired, these names may not resonate with much of who's watching us now, but I admired Jim McKay and Jack Whitaker. Mm-hmm. I admired the best of Howard Cosell. He could be bombastic and a pain in the ass at times, but and in his best moments, he was brave, courageous, and truly journalistic. I think that a good broadcast, and I've had various roles over the course of my career, but over time, there should be a texture to what you do.
Yeah.
There should be some reporting, some journalism, some honest commentary, but also some celebration of the beauty and the shared experience of sports, some humor, some storytelling, all those things. It should have a texture to it. I hope not to have just hit one note repeatedly. A lot of people get by doing that now, and a lot of people get by trying to convince their audience that a middle-aged man, no names mentioned, should be in a state of high dudgeon about 10 different sports topics a day. Not only have an opinion or a take, but be all worked up to the point where you're screaming and practically jumping through the screen at the audience. I can take that for a few minutes just to laugh at it, but I don't think there's much nutrition there.
I've yet to once yell in this home studio for whatever that's worth. I always keep my voice at a reasonable tone and level, but I think that's part of the approach, right? It's the delivery and really, to your point, how much of that is manufactured. How about this? And I've always been curious from your side of it, somebody who's been there, done that at every level. Preparation and execution are two different things for a broadcaster, because I've been in situations where I had all day to prepare, and then the execution of the show or the broadcast came and I was just okay. Like, it didn't go perfect as I wanted it to. There have been other times where I had no time to prepare. It was like, you're on, gotta go, here we go. And the execution was nails. And I sometimes walk away thinking, should I be preparing this much if I'm just able to execute in the moment? How do you see those two things?
Yeah, I think preparation is essential, whether it's for an interview or play-by-play of a game. But what's also essential is the knowledge that you're not likely to use everything, and to be, it seems almost contradictory, but to be prepared, but also spontaneous. You're doing an interview, maybe you have, I never wrote out prepared questions, but maybe you have some notes and some things you'd like to get to.
I do right here.
There you go, right there. But if you're locked in, the question 4 is going to follow question 3.
Right.
And question 3 needs a follow-up, either because it has to be challenged, it has to be clarified, or, wow, that's interesting. Maybe this will lead to something I hadn't anticipated. You have to be nimble enough to, if not throw the preparation out the window, at least put it aside and trust yourself to go down whatever avenue seems to be suggested by what the interview subject said. And when you're doing a game, you prepare as if the game might go 20 innings. You're only going to use about 20% of it. You're just not sure where it's gonna fit.
I think preparation for me is sometimes like batting practice of a baseball team in game 138. It's like, is that really going to improve your hitting for tonight? You've been doing this for months. It's more repetition and superstition, I think, than sometimes anything else. I want to move on to this. And I do not disrespect, I should say, anybody who relies on a teleprompter, because I've done it. You've obviously done it. Certain moments, they dictate the necessity of reading something off a screen, whether it's time constraints or whether it's you got to get every word, like word for word, accurate. But that being said, there are some, I think, in our business who are what I call prompter jockeys, and that's all they do. They're no good when you put them in a live ad-lib type situation. What's your thoughts on that? Because, again, you've done both.
Yeah, I almost always ad-libbed a little bit in and around the prompter, even if it was on the prompter.
Right.
And the producers and directors figured it out at NBC, and they went along with me. We had a pretty good rhythm. But in modern television, especially, very often they need a few words to roll in the B-roll.
Right.
You're talking. They need to know that
they need a cue.
They need a cue. 3 words from now, they're going to roll this particular thing in. So you can't sabotage them by going off on a tangent at the wrong time. I wrote or ad-libbed almost everything of consequence that I did on the air. Some stuff is just boilerplate. It's just traffic. You're at the Olympics and there's too much stuff happening, and somebody writes the lead that will get us from swimming to gymnastics with a few little facts, and I might proofread it and do a little edit, but that's fine. Capable people did that. But if it was an essay of some kind, or the opening of the broadcast, or an editorial of some kind, those were always my own words. I either wrote them or ad-libbed them or some combination of the two. And when people said, I can't tell whether you're reading a prompter or you're ad-libbing, I took that as a supreme compliment.
Yeah,
because you want it to sound like you. You don't want it to sound like something that could have been written by somebody else.
Right, right. Reading your own words is definitely easier and comes across more naturally. I always took it as a huge compliment. When I used to work at NBC, we'd give studio tours and people would come in and say, well, where were all the words you were just saying? Where were you reading those from? It's like, that's the whole magic of this. It didn't go that way.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make an assumption here. And I hope this is an okay question. I'm going to assume that you agreed to do the movie BASEketball because Al Michaels was also doing it. Like if they said it was just you, you wouldn't have felt as comfortable doing it.
100%. Al and I had no way of knowing that almost a decade later, we'd be working together at NBC on Sunday Night Football. We had been friends for a while, but we'd never worked together, and we talked about it. Now, they sent the script to my agent, and my agent was an older guy, meaning he was close to as old as I am now. But I was in my 40s, and I thought I was much hipper. So he reads the script. He goes, I wouldn't do this if I were you. And I go, wait a minute. This is the Zucker Brothers. This is Airplane. This is The Naked Gun.
Right.
This is going to be great.
Right.
Okay. And so Al says, yeah, if you'll do it, I'll do it. So we do it, and we shot it on the last day of filming. Everything else was in the can. We never crossed paths with the South Park guys. We never crossed paths with any of the other sports people who were in it. It was just the two of us. But what we did was essential to the movie because it tied a lot of it together.
Absolutely.
So Al, after we finished the first like 3 or 4 hours of taping, and we did it all in one day, they break for lunch, and Al says, I don't think this is very good. I say, come on, it's fine. Plus, it's a decent payday.
Yeah,
goes,
right.
What?
You're getting paid for this?
He goes, what are you getting? I said,
oh boy.
What are you getting?
Uh-oh.
And if you know Al, he doesn't need the change. He doesn't need the money.
Just wants to be right there with
very
you.
Very competitive.
Yeah.
So I say, okay, let's flip a coin. Whoever loses has to go first.
Uh-oh.
So I lose, and I tell him what I'm getting. It's 5 times what he's getting.
No.
Okay. He is apoplectic. Okay. And he calls his agent and says, you get me what Costas is getting, or I walk. The Zucker brothers, who loved us up until that point, right? The Zucker brothers are like, hey, he signed a contract. That's that. Michael says, fine, I'm leaving. Whoa, wait a minute. We have no movie. We already shot half of this with both of you in it. They came back, and not only did they match what I was getting, they gave him a little bit more, sort of like Al's version of punitive damages for emotional distress or whatever. So when the movie first came out, I was very embarrassed by it. I don't think it did much business. I think it was, in what was then the Blockbuster store by about a month after it was released. But the trailer included the infamous line, "You're excited, feel these nipples." Okay. That happened to be my line. Now, Al, by the way, had a bunch of lines in the movie that would never fly today.
Right. The age of the cheerleader one. And actually, your reaction without any dialogue was the perfect thing. You just kind of go, whoa.
Right. You nailed that's exactly what it was. Al, hard to believe that only a few weeks ago, the Milwaukee Bears, were in 5th place. Yes, and hard to believe only a few weeks ago, these cheerleaders were in the 5th grade. That shuts everything down today.
He said that. Like, you didn't at least have to say that. He had to say that. Like, that's his voice, which still sounds the same beautifully. But that's captured forever now. But it was funny back then. Definitely was.
Yeah, and so now I find out. So I'm embarrassed, but my son, now 38, was 12 when that came out. And he and his friends thought this was the greatest thing ever. They loved it. They also loved Pootie Tang, which I stumbled into a few years after that. And now I realize that BASEketball has a certain cult following. I view it very differently through the rearview mirror than I did at the time.
You know what? It'll live on forever, and in a fun way. It was a slice of life at that time. Speaking of now, though, and an actual serious job role for you, you've stepped down from play-by-play duties. And when I heard this, it was before you and I had made contact. I thought it was premature, and I didn't believe it. And I'm thinking, well, maybe he just is done with it or tired of it. But I started to listen to your explanation, And it kind of sounded like you felt like you just were not entirely on top of your game anymore, which,
Yeah.
Bob, I'll be honest, I didn't notice that.
Well, thank you. And I've gotten so much complimentary and supportive comments from people within the business, from fans and viewers, from people within baseball. But I just felt I couldn't consistently hit my lifetime batting average anymore. If people say that some of the things that people I think are kind of dumb about this stuff, oh, I don't want to hear history, or I don't want to hear a story. The problem was not the approach. That has always been my approach, to have it be a blend of calling the action, but also some commentary, filling in some of the spaces that baseball allows. The question was, how deftly can you do it? Mm-hmm. And I think I did it pretty deftly for a long period of time. But I just felt I couldn't, especially on the sharpness part. I wasn't as quick to identify the ball off the bat, especially on a long fly ball. The words that used to come to me without thinking in a split second, sometimes they didn't. Was it okay? Yeah, it was okay. And at times it was better than okay. But it wasn't at my career level. Now, what happens, this goes back to the very first question you asked. So indulge me here. I'm not spending too much of my time going through what's out there in the morass of the internet, but you get the general sense of it. And something that that bothered me a little bit was those who said, he's a terrific studio host, he's a very good essayist, he's an interviewer, he does all that stuff, but he's not a good play-by-play guy. Now but they're basing that on most recent returns.
Right.
There's no way, I hate to make the case for myself, but there's no way that someone gets into the broadcasters wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame the first time they appear on the ballot if they don't have a history of doing good work
at a high level for a long time.
Yeah, and there's no way you get Emmy nominations in that category and all the rest. Now, of course, people have their personal taste.
Of course,
there are people out there, believe it or not, who didn't like Vin Scully, and people who didn't like Harry Carey because he was too bombastic, but people who loved him for that very reason. So there are always those differences. And I understand people might say, I liked him calling games, but I liked him even better doing this or that.
Right.
But the idea that I should be judged as a play-by-play guy on the last 2 or 3 seasons, that's like judging some guy whose lifetime batting average is this based on what generally happens in the last few years before a guy retires. The other part that bothered me is the notion that my decision was predicated on internet reaction. I'm smart enough to know that you have to separate that from the general consensus. But also, I'd made the decision a year and a half before.
Yeah.
It was going to be my last year doing it, no matter how well or not well it went. I just felt it was time to step aside.
As you view all the different roles that you've served over the years, whether it's play-by-play or studio host or interviewer, if that's like a separate sub role, all the different things you've done, is there a favorite thing that you enjoy doing the most? And let me ask kind of a side question there. Do you think you're best at your favorite thing, or what are you best at and what's your favorite?
This might not be the direct answer to your question. Baseball was always my favorite.
Okay.
And what was very gratifying to me was that over time, if this doesn't sound too overblown, I think I was a citizen of the game. Yes, I called games, but I also was a commentator.
Right.
I wrote a book about baseball. I did a lot of interviews. I was part of Ken Burns' baseball series. I was called upon to eulogize Mickey Mantle and Stan Musial and Hank Aaron and Bob Gibson and Joe Morgan. And I'll be part of Bob Uecker's memorial service in early April. I think I had a different, and I'll use the word again, kind of a textured part in baseball, of which calling games was only one part, but I just loved being around the game. I loved getting to know the players that came out of my youth or even before.
Yeah.
And I loved being around. I loved being in the clubhouse or in the dugout or by the batting cage. But also, to the earlier thing we were talking about, as you get older, you're not as much a part of that. you still go about your duties. You still talk to the manager and whatnot. But, Ozzie Smith and I are roughly the same age. I just saw him in St. Louis.
Yeah.
So when Ozzie's playing, it's entirely plausible that it happened that he and I could go to dinner or go have a beer.
Right.
Bryce Harper says hi to me. I don't think I'm hanging out with him. He knows who I am.
Right. Right.
So something, you're not as connected no matter how professionally you try to approach it. I still think that I'm not only good, but maybe it should be my role that I'm kind of the emeritus guy. Regrettably, when a Willie Mays passes away, or when something historical happens, someone passes a milestone, or we're asked to compare this to that. I think that's probably my best role now, is kind of a history guy, rather than if I'm asked to be on the Baseball Network to discuss whether the Rangers should trade Jacob deGrom, I can do that. But they got 20 guys at the Baseball Network who can also do that. Some of them can do it better than I can.
Play to your strengths, I think, is your theme nowadays.
Right. That would be the concise version of what I just rambled about for 3 minutes.
Hey, I've been listening. See, I just try. That's all I do. I repackage things into smaller forms.
That's excellent.
I don't want you to get too deep into this because I know it's very personal, but your dad had a history with sports gambling.
Yes.
And I know now in this day and age, what we're starting to see is so prevalent: sports wagering, betting, gambling. Mm-hmm. It's advertised with. Not in California because it's not legal here in the state, but pretty much everywhere else. What's your thoughts on the emergence of sports gambling and, like I said, how frequent it is right in front of the consumer? And does it matter? Is that a bad thing, a good thing? Should anybody care?
My thoughts on this were delivered on HBO a couple of years ago. It's on YouTube. If you just put in Bob Costas on sports betting or sports gambling, It's a 5 or 6 minute commentary that takes into account my own personal history with gambling. I looked at my dad as a colorful, kind of Runyon-esque character, and I learned a lot about sports just by hanging around with him, because he didn't bet on cards or crap games or go to the racetrack. He bet on games. And so not only was I following the games with him, but he would often send me out to the car in the driveway where the reception was better than in the house, because you didn't have sports phone or ESPN or the internet, obviously. And if he bet on the Tigers and it wasn't on TV on Long Island, I had to go find Ernie Harwell on WJR and then come back and report the scores. And by osmosis, what that became was, I'm like 10, 11 years old. Hey, Bob Prince sounds different in Pittsburgh than Chuck Thompson in Baltimore, or Ernie Harwell in Detroit, or Jack Buck and Harry Carey in St. Louis. And they're all different, but they're all good in different ways, in addition to Mel Allen and Red Barber and Lindsey Nelson, who I was listening to in New York. So I think that's where I caught the sportscasting bug. But the bottom line, I think, on the gambling part is this. If, in the big picture, the house didn't always come out in front, if over time and as a group, gamblers didn't lose much more than they win, then DraftKings, BetMGM, whatever it is, FanDuel, none of that would exist any more than Nathan Detroit's traveling crap game would exist, or any casino or racetrack would exist. Now, if knowing that, you go into it with, this is how much I'm going to Vegas or whatever it is, this is how much I'm willing to lose, I'll have a good time, that's fine. But just be aware. And also be aware that when they say, hey, the first $200 is free, that is a high-tech gambling site version of the pusher in the alley.
Right.
Hey, kid, first one's free.
Right.
He's hoping to hook you.
Yeah, it's a lot of the same stuff that's been happening for years. It's happening, though, in a new way, and it's so much more accessible. We talked about phones earlier, the fact that it's right in front of you.
Yes.
I'm watching a game. I can't stop myself. It's a societal problem that I think we're just kind of realizing we've never been here before, though. It's like I said, it's a lot of the same things. They're just presented in new ways. And I just think it's something for the sports community to pay attention to, because we just haven't gotten deep in it yet.
In fairness, Brody, they're still maintaining the same rules pertaining to betting on the sport you're involved in as existed previously. That's their answer about how can this be sponsored by DraftKings, but Pete Rose has never been on the ballot. And in fairness, there have been instances in baseball. There's one with an umpire that broke justice.
Pat Hoberg just got fired.
Right.
Baseball's most accurate home plate umpire called the perfect game in the 2022 World Series, 127 balls and strikes, 1,000% accurate, fired because he was sharing a sports betting account. Why even do, could he not stop himself from doing that?
It's stupid. And he wasn't betting on baseball.
That's what he said. So he said his friend was, the account was, but he said he wasn't.
Yes, right. So, which is dubious. But we've seen suspensions in the NFL.
Right.
We saw the situation with the player with the Toronto Raptors.
In the NBA.
Which is really a serious one.
Yeah.
Because those prop bets fly under the radar.
Right.
For the most part. So he's like a fringe player.
Right.
Maybe the over-under on how many points he'll score in the game is 5 or 6.
Right.
He comes into the game. He either gets in foul trouble on purpose or feigns a minor injury, goes out of the game.
Right, exactly, right.
And his associates have bet the under. The leagues have to be even more vigilant than ever. Yeah. But in fairness, even as they glom on to all this money, that this new source of revenue that gambling provides, they haven't budged really in their proclaimed standard. If you're involved in this sport in any way, official, umpire, manager, coach, whatever.
Yeah.
It's at least a year's suspension, I think. In baseball, it is a year's suspension if you bet on games you're not involved in, and it's still a Pete Rose, Joe Jackson standard. If you bet on games you are involved in, lifetime banishment.
Because of this channel, because of what I do here, because of my background, I'm almost obligated to ask you a question about the, I guess, former Oakland A's. It feels weird to even say that. Now they're just the Athletics. They play in Sacramento, which is about 90 minutes drive away from the immediate Bay Area. Apparently, they're still trying to go to Las Vegas, even though a lot remains to be seen with the final conclusions on that. You once said you thought that the A's were tanking in Oakland, that they were kind of like trying purposely to kill off the fan base, make themselves irrelevant so that a move would be a lot easier. In reverse, I mean, it really is like a real-life version of the movie Major League. How do you see this process? How do you see all of this? And I'll tell you what I think is most disturbing. The A's are doing this, but there's a lot of other sports franchises out there using the threat of relocation because they're not getting what they want from a stadium or venue perspective.
Right. Well, there was significant sentiment in St. Louis, for example, that the Rams were tanking toward the end of their relatively short run in St. Louis so that they could return to Los Angeles, which turns out to be a much more lucrative situation. You could never have a SoFi. You could never have all the Super Bowls and the events coming to St. Louis that would come there. Understandable if they wanted to do it. More than annoying that they weren't upfront and honest about it. And you see tanking can be a legitimate strategy. The Astros did it. Say anything you want about Jeff Luhnow. He was one of the smartest people in the game, and he had a plan. And remember, Ben Reiter wrote a piece like in 2013. It was the cover story of Sports Illustrated. Your 2017 world champion.
Right, and it turned out to be true. Yeah.
Yeah, and in a different way, but the same basic idea. Theo Epstein did it in Chicago with the Cubs. That's not the way the Red Sox did it when they broke the curse, but it's the way the Cubs did it. It's certainly the way the Astros did it. If that's your honest plan to build a team that way.
To regenerate.
Or to swap decent but not great players in return for draft choices or younger players. And maybe you take a hit in the one-loss column in the short term, but it builds something in the long term. But I don't think that's what the A's were up to. I give the manager and the players of the A's a hell of a lot of credit for playing as well as they did, surprisingly well, in the second half of the season under those adverse conditions. I wasn't there. I don't know any of them, but I think there had to be a tremendous sense of pride. We're professional baseball players. We're not going to let down pride in ourselves, pride in what this uniform means to us, pride in our obligation to the game. Now, I think what's going to happen in Sacramento, which may annoy a lot of Oakland fans, is that at least in the short term, this is going to be a cult team. People are going to want to come to a cozy little minor league ballpark. They're going to adopt them as their team if they don't have a strong rooting interest in another team. I think they'll play to a full house every night.
Well, they better. It's only 10,000 seats. Like if they don't sell out, that's also a problem, you know?
Right. I mean, there'll be a cool factor about it. The A's will become a sentimental favorite.
It's a honeymoon. It's a honeymoon period, no doubt.
Yeah.
I think that the point is, for a lot of people here in the Bay Area, as a sports fan, what you sign up for is my team might lose some games. My team might lose some big games. My team might trade away some favorite players over the years. Yeah. Nobody, though, prepares themselves to put their heart and soul into loving a franchise, and then that franchise basically turning its back on you, walking away without a lot of good explanation or reason, or trying to stay.
Yeah.
It's all very much a front, and then the fans are even blamed for it at the very end. I don't know. I can't express, and I don't know if you've ever lost a team, so to speak, but, personally and professionally for me, I mean, I can't even describe this experience, and I hate that I've had it, but it's something unique that I don't know a lot of sports fans, fortunately, don't ever have to go through.
My friend and colleague, Matt Vasgersian, grew up as an A's fan. And
right around the corner from me, yeah.
I'm sure you saw the piece he did toward the end, this kind of wistful, poignant piece he did about the Oakland Coliseum, and maybe a dump, but it was our dump.
Yeah.
But that was another part of tanking, in my view. It wasn't just the one-loss record; it was the quality of the ballpark.
Right.
Some old stadiums have charm. The Oakland Coliseum did not have charm, unless you remember being there for a Raiders game, or unless you remember seeing Reggie Jackson hit a home run there in a big situation.
Or the 1989 World Series, and it's so cool that I became friends with Dave Stewart over all the years, and Carney and Terry Steinbach and all that stuff, yeah. So, no, I agree with you. From the outside looking in, it's two different things. A couple more things I want to get to, Bob, and I'm very conscious of the time here, and I appreciate all of this so far.
But now let's see if we can screw it up in the remaining minutes.
Here's where it gets interesting. You took some stances against football with a lot of CTE evidence that came out.
Yes.
Do you regret using your platform, even though I know you were speaking your mind in a very thoughtful and sensible way?
No. I think that there are certain things that are kind of elephants in the room, whether it was steroids in baseball, which I think was ahead of the curve on, and pointing out that something was happening here, and it was poisoning the record books, and it was forcing players who are not inclined to use performance-enhancing drugs to either do it against their better judgment to keep up, or to compete at a competitive disadvantage.
Yeah.
Those things were pertinent. I think it's pertinent that if you're covering the Olympics, that the IOC has a very questionable affinity for authoritarian regimes. And I talked about that as best I could. Obviously, I had more leeway when I was on HBO, because on NBC, you have to slip it into the spaces.
Right.
Whereas HBO stuff was devoted to that. Hey, if we hired you, that's what we hired you for. Do what you want to do, say what you want to say. But I don't regret it. I think I was on the right side of all of those issues. And the only thing I regret about it is that it led to a breakup with NBC that could have been handled more graciously. It didn't serve either side well, and there have been moments to make that right. Al Michaels and I sat with Mike Tirico the last night of the Olympics in Paris, and people seem to like that. I think there's some sort of return that can make this a little more gracious and have the kind of closure that both parties want to have. Because it was never a case of, I didn't want to position myself like I'm the knight in shining armor and these guys are the soulless corporate suits.
Right.
They have a job to do. Someone from the NFL office calls and says, "Hey, can you rein Costas in?" There's billions of dollars in rights fees. It's the ratings generator for the network. It's the biggest thing on that. I get that. Yeah. They have their priorities. I had mine. But I always felt, Brody, and I'm sure you feel the same way, if you're not willing to acknowledge, not necessarily harp on them, but acknowledge the elephants in the room, you diminish your credibility when you say, honestly, this is so great. There's no place I'd rather be than here.
Yep.
Wish you were here. This is wonderful. That if that's all you do, and we don't need to name names, but there are many people who've had very long careers, and that's all they do.
Yes, sir.
They wouldn't say bleep if they had a mouthful. Okay. And those people, in my mind, no matter how good they may be at their craft, are not shooting straight.
Yeah. I mean, you and I both have that in common too. We both let's say, been dismissed by NBC. And I can't go into it too much more than that, but I definitely relate to what you said there about, taking a stand and being observant of what's going on. The final thing I want to end on here is, and just somebody like myself who's mid-career, probably, hopefully I've got a lot of years left in presenting and broadcasting and sports media. I've always found that people who helped me the most are not what you might think. They are actually the people who are hard on me and critical of me, because too often there's, hey, good job, this was great. I actually get better from the people who I trust and respect, who gave me the advice that actually got me better. I'm wondering if that was the case for you, and then maybe what advice you would give for somebody like myself, like I said, who's probably mid-career in what I'm doing.
Well, I think you're doing fine. And now the only question is, as the media landscape changes, how do you adjust to that and pick your spots and find the places that make the best use, not only of your abilities, but your sense abilities, which are to a certain extent different than the prevailing tone. I think if you're talking about criticism, you want to find people who, in the big picture, think you're good at what you do and appreciate what you do and understand what your objective is. Then those criticisms, if they come, are, here's where you're falling short of your best self. Here's where you're falling short of your objective. You shouldn't be listening to people who think you aren't worth a damn, because they're probably wrong anyway. Right. I'll tell you a story that may not directly answer this question, but I had an advisor at Syracuse University. This goes back to the early 1970s. And he saw in me, I was on the campus radio station, as were a bunch of other people, some of whom wound up in the business, most of whom didn't. And he saw in me something I didn't see in myself. I remember telling Al Michaels when we first became friendly, I heard him on the radio when he was the voice of the Cincinnati Reds in the 1972 World Series. And back then, the networks would use at least one announcer from each of the competing teams in the World Series. And sometimes they do the radio and sometimes they do TV. And I'm listening to Al Michaels, and I'm 20 years old. And I'm listening to Al Michaels, and boy, this guy's good. He sounds a little like Vin Scully. And then I try to find out something about him, not as easy as today. And I find out he's 26, 27 years old. And my thought was, I am doomed. I can't be nearly as good as this guy ever, let alone in 5 or 6 years. And I'd listened to myself on a cassette recorder, and it wasn't anything like what I hoped it would sound like. And I was becoming very discouraged. And this professor said, no, if you work at it, you can be good at it. And he actually, I guess he liked me personally as well, he would listen to games I did on the radio, on the campus radio station. And when I got a job doing minor league hockey in the old Eastern Hockey League, he'd listen to those games, not because he cared if the Syracuse Blazers would beat the Johnstown Jets, but because he was listening to me.
Right.
And this continued well into my career at NBC.
Wow.
Like I thought I was, riding pretty high, and I'd hear from him. Saw the game the other day. Shouldn't have done that. That was good. This wasn't. Because that role continued. He was always my professor.
He was invested in you. Absolutely.
His student.
Yeah.
Yes. And, this may sound corny. He was a Red Sox fan, lived in Syracuse. So I was doing a game about 10 years ago with Jim Cott at Fenway Park, and I invited him to come to the game. So we have lunch before, and we go out to the ballpark, and he's in the little booth at Fenway sitting behind. And I turned around during a commercial, and I must have said something that pleased him in the preceding half inning. There were tears in his eyes. That's someone who is so devoted to what he does. Being a professor or a teacher wasn't just a paycheck. That was who he was. That was his craft. He was devoted to it. And I was one of his star pupils, I guess, in his mind. And it was moving to him that he played a part in what became of my life. Now, you can't always have something like that, but, find someone who believes in you, believes that you're good, believes in what you are trying to achieve, and then honestly lets you know when you really got there, and then also levels with you when you didn't.
I hope this conversation makes two things very apparent. Number one, what a generous human being you are to have this time with me and the conversation. But number two, for the audience to understand that you're even doing this speaks to who you are as a person. So I really appreciate it more than you know, and I hope everybody else can comprehend that too. Bob, this has been awesome.
Thank you, Brody. I hope we'll stay in touch.